Hi, and welcome back. So now let's start looking at something called properties. And properties are actually a little bit different than attributes. And we'll see exactly how that works. So we saw that we can define what I would call bare attributes in classes and instances. For example, we have this self.language in our init over here, where we're creating an instance attribute, and it's directly accessible from our code. So if we create this object to be an instance of my class, then we can access the value for language by just saying object.language. So that's going to be the language value for that particular instance. We can also set that particular instance's language attribute directly by just accessing the attribute directly, again using dot notation, or we can also use the getAttr and setAttr method. And we can set it equal to some value. So this is a direct access to the language attribute, right? Now in many languages, direct access to attributes is highly discouraged. And if you come from a Java background, for example, you know that in general, you never write public attributes directly in your classes. You make private attributes, and then you create methods, get and set methods, right? The accessor methods to get and set those particular attributes. So that's the convention in Java very often. Make the attribute private, create public getter and setter methods. But in Python, we don't have private attributes, right? So we don't have that concept of private and public. Now there is a convention though, where we can use an underscore. So when we use an underscored attribute name in our class, then other developers realize right away that this is technically a private attribute and they shouldn't be messing around with it directly. Now Python basically lets us do that though. It lets us do whatever we want. So as developers, if we want to mess with somebody's private attribute, we can. Python doesn't stop us from doing that, but by convention, we shouldn't, because it's probably not safe to do so, unless you know exactly what you're doing, or maybe you wrote the class yourself and you know that it's safe to modify that pseudo-private attribute. Don't do it. Don't touch it. So instead, what we would do, and this is kind of following the Java pattern here, we create a private, so I'm using air quotes because it's not really private, but by convention it's private. So we have this pseudo-private variable called underscore language, and we set it equal to the value that gets passed in when we initialize the class. Then we write the accessor as methods. So we have the getLanguage method. So it's going to be a method that's going to be called from an instance. It'll be bound to that instance, and it's going to return the underscore language attribute of that instance that it's bound to. And then we do the same thing with the set language, except we now pass in the new value that we want to set it to, and then we have self._language equals value. We're now modifying the underscore, the pseudo-private attribute in the instance to whatever the new value is. But here's the difference in now how we have to use this code. And let me ask you this, what code would you rather write? Would you rather be able to write object.language and object.language equals Java? Or would you rather write something like this, print object.getLanguage? Because remember, in Java, underscore language would not be accessible at all. It's private, okay? So here, we would have to say object dot, and we would have to use the getter method, the getLanguage, and call it as a method. Or if we want to set the language, we would have to again call a method called setLanguage, bound of course to the object, and then we pass it the value that we want. Which is more readable code? Well, obviously the first one is. At least I think it is. Okay. So let's take a look at this class again. So that's the init, right? And we've got the getter and the setter. So in this case, language is considered the instance property. Now it doesn't really exist. There is no such thing as a .language property on this class. But we understand that there is a property called language because there's a get language and a set language. That's the case in Java. And here I'm just mimicking that over here. So that property is only accessible via those two methods, getLanguage and setLanguage, right? Technically, we can also get it from its private underlying variable, the underscore language, but let's assume that we can't touch that and we shouldn't be touching it. So there's good reasons why we might want to use these methods to access and set the attribute. And that's because it provides us control on how the value is set and returned. And we'll see lots of examples of that. But one of the things, for example, is we might be able to set, when you call set language, we might be able to validate which value you're passing in and saying, well, if you're not passing in one of these, 15 languages, I'm not going to accept the value that you're passing in. Maybe I'll raise an exception. Or if you try and do a get, let's say, maybe it's a computed property. And we'll see those again in detail. But maybe it's not really a value that's stored on the class, but it's a value that's derived by some calculation on the data that is in the class, in the instance. Okay? In that case, that's a computed property. And so we do a get, we wouldn't actually have a property that we can access directly. We'd have to use a method. Maybe the area of a circle, where the circle has a radius as a property, as an attribute. So it provides us control basically over how we can get and set attributes on the instance. Okay? And so we call those properties simply because they're not exactly bare attributes anymore. They're going through these methods, this get and set. Now, if you start with a class that provides direct access to the language attribute, let's say, so instead of doing a self_language, I'd just say self.language equals language, then we can access language directly using dot notation. Now later, and this is the case in Java, I need to go back and say, well, no, I don't want to access directly the bare attribute. I need to go through these functions, these methods, because I need to provide some additional functionality when you get and set these values. Well, in that case, you're now changing the interface to your class, right? Because any object that used code like this, like object.language equals Java, so it was accessing the bare language attribute directly, now has to be refactored to use the set method, object.setLanguage to Java. So that's why typically in a language like Java, you never start with the bare attribute, because even if it's okay to directly set, let's say, a string attribute to any possible value, later on, if you need to bring in some extra functionality that basically maybe validates the data before you set it, then you're going to have to change the interface of your class to use this set language instead of the direct language. So that's why in Java, we don't do that. We always basically make private attributes. So we follow this pattern over here. We create a private attribute, and then we do a get and set with the attribute name that we want. And then we say language is a property of that class. So Python has a solution to this, of course, right? And we can use a special class, a special type in Python called property that defines properties in a class. And let's see how that works. So initially, I might start with a bare attribute called language, right? So I've got self.language equals language. Now, when I create an instance of my class, I can access language directly, I can set it, I can read it using the bare attribute. Now, I want to go back and I want to say, no. I want to use methods to get and set this particular language attribute. So we can go ahead and create a particular type of object, which is a property object. So property is a class, and we can create an instance of this class, and it has some arguments that we can set. And in particular, it has the fget and fset arguments for the function getter and function setter. And we specify functions over here, get language and set language. So let's take a look at those functions. So get language. So we're defining a function inside the class, which means that when we call it from the instance, it will be a method bound to the instance. So the first argument is going to be the instance. And now we can return, this is the getter, we can return self._language, which is the same underscore language that was initialized in our initializer. So this is the get language, right? This is what we were doing before. So this portion of the class is no different than what we had before. The only difference now is that I've made this language, which is now a bare attribute on the class. This is a class attribute, but it happens to be this special object, this property object. And then the fset is the set language. So now when we use that, we can create an instance of my class. And now when I say m.language, you'll notice it's the same code as what I have before. I haven't changed my code at all in how I use the class. But what's different now is that when I say m.language equals Java, I'm calling the setter method. And so Python realizes, okay, language is a property now, and you have this fset defined. So when I say m.language equals Java, it's going to call the setLanguage method for the object m, passing it the value Java. So it's going to essentially call setLanguage, m, Java. So you'll notice also that with the getter, it's the same thing. m.language, I'm actually calling the getter method. So again, Python sees this as, oh, this language is a property on the class, so I need to do something a little bit different. I'm going to call whatever's defined for fget. So it's going to call the getLanguage as a method bound to m. And so it's going to call this getLanguage method over here. So you'll notice that even though we've changed from a bare attribute approach to these property getter and setters in the class, the way we actually call this language property and use this language property in our code has not changed. Which is why in Python we usually start with bare attributes until such a time when we need to use getters and setter methods for some reason or other. Then we implement them at that time. But the code that uses it doesn't have to change. We're not breaking the interface. Our class is backward compatible, essentially, right? And so that's why in Python, we don't start with properties right off the bat. We start with bare attributes. That's much simpler to use. It's more direct. But if we need to, we can go back and change it without breaking anything in our code. And that's really important. So the property class. Let me just talk to you a little bit about that. The property object is a class. It is a type. It's a special type. And the constructor has a few parameters. It has the fget parameter, which specifies the function to use to get the instance property value, to retrieve the property value for the instance. And it will be called as a bound method. Then we have fset, which specifies the function in the class to use to set the instance property value. We also have the fdel, which is the function that we're going to use when we want to delete the instance property. Just like we can delete an attribute from a class, we can also delete a property from a class instance, right? And then we also have doc, which is something that allows us to specify a doc string for that particular property. So that later on, if you call help on your class, you'll get some help for that particular property as well that will get displayed there. So in general, again, we start with the plain attributes, and if later we need to change to a property, we can do so by using the property class without changing the interface. So let's take a look at how we do it again. So here's the class, right? I've got my init, I've got my getter and my setter for language. I'm using a pseudo private variable for language, and that's what I use to get and set basically as my storage for my property. Then I declare an attribute. I create an attribute on the class, but that attribute is an instance of a property object, and in it I pass it the fget and fset. It's rare that we use the fdelete, but you can use that too sometimes. So now let's see how that works. We call my class, passing it Python. So we're passing it Python as the language here. My class gets created first. Then the init is called as a bound method. So the self is going to be m, the language is going to be Python. And on the instance m, we set the underscore language attribute to Python. So now if we look at the dictionary of m, if we look at that namespace, we'll see that that namespace m contains underscore language. It doesn't contain language. It contains the underscore language because that's what we did in the init. We said self.underscore language. That has a value of Python. Now, if I say m.language equals Java, what am I doing? I'm setting the property language to the value Java. What's actually happening at that point is that it's going to call the fset method, the set language. Now, what does the set language do? It sets self.underscore language equal to the new value. So after this has executed, if we look at the namespace of M, you'll see that the underscore language value has now changed to Java. But language, again, is not in the dictionary of the instance. Remember how Python looks for attributes? Because when I say m.language, what is it going to do first? It's going to look for the language attribute, right, that key, in the instance dictionary. It doesn't find it. It's not in the dictionary. What does it do? Well, it looks in the class namespace now. So it didn't find language in the instance namespace. It goes up to the class. So it goes to my class and it finds language. That language is in the class dictionary. It is in that class namespace, not necessarily the dictionary, but it's definitely in the namespace. So it looks for it there. Now it finds it, and it happens to be a property type object. So now Python knows, okay, hang on, wait a minute. This is a special kind of value. It's a property instance, right? It's an instance of the property type. So I need to do something different. In this case, I'm setting a value. So it says, okay, I'm going to use the fset argument. So whatever was defined, set language. So it calls set language as a bound method to the instance it was called from. So it uses the accessor methods. Now, how does it do that exactly? We'll come back to that later. But there's another way. Again, we have to dig a little bit deeper to understand how does Python not only understand that this is a property, but how does it actually do all that? What's the mechanics for doing all that? Right now, I want to focus on how we use this and kind of how it's working behind the scenes. But we'll get into more detail later. All right, so let's switch to some code and let's try all this out. It's actually very straightforward. So I'll see you in a bit. Thanks for watching.